Okay, let me share the screen. And here we go. Okay, so.
Hey, look at you.
Okay, so welcome to Wayne, who actually is a real person, in case anyone didn't know that. Okay, so let's take a look at the biurim that we're going to start last week. So what are we talking about? We're talking about if you're a farmer and you're working with an animal or a human being, and they are working with gidulei karka, things that are growing from the ground, the Torah obligates you to allow them to eat from the produce while they are harvesting. Specifically, it's during the harvest. Okay? And as we'll see in just a moment, it's because of a sense of kindness that you need to show to someone, because it would be considered to be cruel if you were to deprive them of the opportunity to eat while they're working with food. Okay, and we'll see later on if this has any applications to non-farming situations, okay? But first, let's look at the exemplar that's written by the Torah, and then we'll have to move it to other cases. Okay, so first of all, lahasir mimena kol monea, you have to remove from an animal any kind of impediment that would prevent it from eating, like a muzzle, okay? B'lachein, and we saw this before, im yashav lakotz befiha, if, let's say, an animal has a thorn in its mouth and therefore can't eat because it's painful for it to eat, you have to remove the thorn from the animal's mouth to enable it to eat. Even if the thorn got into the animal's mouth, not of any fault of your own, it just happened to be eating something from, it was grazing, and it grabbed onto something that had a thorn, okay? But you still have an obligation before you work that animal. If you notice that the animal has a thorn, you have to remove that thorn. But that which we say that you're not allowed to work the animal until you remove the impediment, it's only if it's within your power to remove the impediment. But so, for example, the animal is thirsty. You have the ability to give the animal water. You have an obligation to do so while you're working the animal. But let's say the animal is not eating because of an internal illness. It's not within and you don't have the ability to cure the animal, right? So in that situation, you're still allowed to work the animal because there are no options open to you to correct the animal's anguish. So the Torah only obligates you to correct the animal or to provide the animal its feed when you have the ability to do so. But if you simply don't have, it's not humanly possible, then there's no prohibition. And as far as whether you'd be permitted to work the animal, there may be, halachically, it seems like it would be permissible, but you'd have to evaluate whether it's the moral or ethical thing to do to work with an animal that's ill and can't eat. Okay, next, bahamoneya is habehema. If you prevent the animal, okay, so isa b'shulchan aruch siman shin lamed ches sivav, dim yashav la kotz b'fia v'dash ba v'harei ino chelas aser v'ino loke. So the similar case, the animal has a thorn in its mouth, but you didn't put it there. It's not like you muzzled the animal. So if you end up working it, it's aser, but in this case, you don't get malchus for that. In all of the cases that we've seen so far, if you work an animal while it's muzzled because you place the muzzle on, you get malchus for that. V'hasma hevi b'shem hatosfos, the dafka b'shanasa kein me'elav, aval im hoshev b'yado asakotz b'via vaday loge. And the Sma says that's provided that it acquired the thorn on its own. But if you were responsible for the thorn getting in its mouth. You inserted the thorn, so then you would get malchus if you worked to the animal, and it's therefore not able to eat. V'lo achla mikoach he says that if you rent an animal, and the animal didn't eat because it has a thorn in its mouth, that you would have to pay, I guess you'd have to pay some kind of compensatory damage to the owner. So let's say I rent your animal. I go ahead and the animal can't eat, and I'm obligated to feed the animal, but the animal refuses to eat. By not removing the thorn, I have to pay you for whatever damage is caused to the animal, plus I have to pay whatever feed the animal would have normally consumed during that rental period. And as Ibra Lanias Daiti Daverzet Sarich Ian, he says, but this sort of I have to think about this. He says it's not so clear. Are Kaimelan de Poel Shomer Labalabayas Tain Leishta Yovanai Mashayali Lechel. He says we have this principle that if a worker says to an employer, I know that you're obligated to feed me. That's our work contract, that during the time that I'm working for you, you have to feed me. But instead, give the food to my wife and children. So what's the halacha? Or let's say he says, the meal that you've provided is very generous. I'd like to take a portion of it and give it to my wife and children, and I'll eat less. Ein shomin lo. He does not have that right. In other words, an employer has an obligation to feed his workers unless the contract is otherwise, but the worker does not have a right to take the lunch and bring it home to his family. That he doesn't have a right to do. Okay, Vahatam kasru aposkim ubismasham dahadapol ochel eno mikoch tosefis charo depoel. And he says, so what's the reason for this halacha? The reason is that a staff lunch is not a fringe benefit. That's not if it was a fringe benefit, then you could take that lunch, that catered meal, and take it home to your family if you wanted to. He says, but that's not what it's for. He says, but the real reason is that it's an act of compassion to a person who's working the whole day and doesn't have an opportunity to go out to eat. He says that's the reason. It's like the mitzvah of leket shechacha and peya, that when you harvest the field, you have to leave gifts for the poor. It's an act of compassion, not a fringe benefit of employment. And so, because of that, if you don't want that, you're not hungry, and I'm keeping you in my office it's a 15-hour work day, and everyone's working overtime. So I promise dinner to all the workers who stay into the evening, right? It's a very common practice. I need you to stay late in the office. Don't worry, I'm bringing in dinner. But that's not a fringe benefit. That's out of compassion that I'm obligated to do that. How can I keep you later in the office without feeding you? You're hungry, right? But that doesn't mean that you have a right to take that dinner and do with it as you wish.
One quick story, and then story is in public accounting, they used to give us an allowance for meals if we worked a certain number of hours. If you work more than 8 hours, they have to give you $25 or something like that. So the partner decided he was going to be clever, and he provided food for everyone, and then said, "Oh, don't think you can take the allowance." So it cost him $10 to provide the food for us, and he didn't have to pay the $25 allowance. Okay. So that was his way around it. It's just kind of a cute little story. Okay. About you thought he was being nice, but he really was trying to save himself some money as part of the partnership.
Sure.
The question I have is, I presume what this is for is to help you work better as well. So by not taking the food but sending it home to your family, you're not working as well as you could if you had a full stomach. So that's also to the detriment of the employer who's giving you that allowance, that food.
Well, I'm not sure if that's the reason. It seems like the reason that is being presented here is out of compassion to a hungry person. And that's the analogy that's being made to this idea of when a person's working out in the field, you have to allow them to take some of the food and nibble on while they're working. And it's in the same vein that we're saying, when you have a worker that's working for you all day and it can't get out of compassion, you have to feed them. Not so much to create greater productivity, but out of human decency, you have to do this.
I hear that's given. I'm just
Yeah.
suggesting that also would have that consequence. If someone was hungry, they wouldn't work as well.
Well, that would be if there was no compassion component here, the employer could say, I don't care about your productivity level. It would be the employer's choice, right? But here the Torah is saying that you have an obligation whether you care about their productivity out of hunger or not. Okay. So anyway, yeah.
And that is, if you say to the employer, I'd rather bring my own food and give you the allowance to give it to my family. It's kashrut, maybe it's something else. Is there any way where you could say, I will eat, but I don't want to take your food?
Well, it's a question of what you have a right to demand. Obviously, in a modern work situation, if the boss is giving you a $25 allowance and he's just adding it to your paycheck, and then you go ahead and you spend $10 instead of $25 on lunch, you're not obligated to give back the extra $15, right? And if the boss says, here, I'm giving out lunch to everybody, and you decide that you want to bring your bag lunch, you don't have to eat the food. But the question is, do you have a right to make a doggy bag from the catered lunch and bring it home to your family? And the answer is no. You have to ask permission from, there are times like even here, we'll serve lunch to the staff if we have a working lunch meeting, right? The only time that you can take leftovers is if they're leftovers. If there's an extra food, well, what are we going to do with the extra food? We can either share it with some of the facility staff that are not part of our lunch meeting, or we can have people take it home. But no one has an entitlement to say, I'm going to pack myself some of the food and take it home to my family. No one has a right halachically to do that. But if the employer gives permission, then of course it's okay. Okay. So anyway, so how do we get to this? So anyway, so the employee only actually acquires the food by halachic rights once he puts it in his mouth. Before it goes in his mouth, it still belongs to the employer, and you don't have a right, therefore, to take it and bring it home to your family. And therefore, it should seem obvious that you have an employee who's not able to eat. He's got some kind of oral problem. He can't chew food. Okay? He doesn't have a right to give others the free lunch that's being provided to him. The lo zach selo Torah daim, because the Torah hasn't given it to him yet until he puts it in his mouth. Be'im kain, if so, how does this apply to what we've said above? That if I work with an animal that has a thorn in its mouth, I have to pay the owner of the animal for the food that the animal didn't eat. So he says, I don't understand. He says, so certainly in a case where I actively muzzle the animal, then I could understand why I have a financial liability to pay for the food that the animal was supposed to eat under my care. But he says, but in a case that we're discussing now, where the animal acquired the thorn on its own, no fault of mine. Animal was grazing, got a thorn in its mouth. Now it can't eat. And now I'm returning it to its owner. And the owner says, you gave me back an emaciated animal You should pay for the grain that it was supposed to eat while it was under your care. But why can't the renter argue? He says, why am I obligated to pay? The animal couldn't eat, and it wasn't my fault. So why should I have to pay for the food that it would have eaten had it not had the thorn in its mouth? Just like the employee who decides not to eat the lunch, the food, he doesn't have an entitlement to compensation for lunch. He just has the right to consume the food that I provide for him. So rak etzem hadavar shemishas meshichan is chayv b'mezonoseh, v'hamitzido ein shum miniak bazeh. He says, so therefore he does, Rav Stern is just sort of questioning, why would you say that I have an obligation to cover the cost of the animal's feed when in reality I did nothing to prevent the animal from eating? We know that the law of muzzling is the same for both animals and humans. Etc., etc. He says, how then can we obligate the renter payment for the animal's grain that it didn't eat if this whole question is a question that is not resolved in the Gemara as far as what the halacha is regarding the obligation to remove the thorn? Maybe the Torah doesn't obligate a person to remove the thorn. So he says, and therefore I have a difficulty with this whole issue. And then he says at the end, I've noticed that there are Rishonim who say that you wouldn't have to pay because of the principle of Hamotze Mechavera Olav Haraya. And this goes against the Sema. And there are other commentaries who say this as well. And so in the summation of this halacha, he's basically coming out that you aren't obligated to pay for the feed that the animal ended up not eating as a result of it having a thorn in its mouth. Now, should you have removed the thorn? Yes, lechatchila, you had an obligation to remove the thorn. But there's a machlokus in the Gemara whether you're obligated or not. We paskin l'chumra that you have to. But because it's a machlokus in the Gemara, and it's never resolved, we can't obligate you to pay for the animal's feed that it didn't eat in the event when you didn't remove the thorn. And the only thing that we like, the reason why I found this to be an interesting commentary is just this idea that when your employer provides you with a meal, it's not a fringe benefit, but rather a form of benevolence to feed a worker when they're working all day without the opportunity to get out. And therefore, as such, it's not automatically theirs before they put it in their mouth. It only becomes theirs once property becomes theirs once they put it in their mouth. Okay.
Has to bring this animal back to good health by feeding it more. He's now financially worse off because the thorn wasn't.
That's right. That's right.
What we're saying, despite that, he's not entitled to.
Right. We're saying despite that, he's not entitled to compensation because the renter could say, I was not obligated, or it's a machlokus whether I was obligated to remove the thorn or not. You knew that when you rented out your animal, that could be a possibility that the animal may not eat while it's under my care. And unless you contracted for it specifically, I have no obligation to pay. I offered the animal feed, it refused the feed, and therefore I'm not liable. That's the argument that he's making. Okay, let us go on to the next halacha. Now, Chav Gimel, Uvid Talush. Now, when we're dealing with already harvested produce, Okay, just regular food. That's not out in the field. Eino ochel, ella kisha'osa kodem shenigmar malachto shal min zeh, the inyan chi of meiser. So he said, ilu haya bisman sha'ameiser haya noheg. So he says, when you have an employee or an animal that is working with harvested produce, it's no longer attached to the ground, okay? Is the employee or the animal allowed to eat from the already harvested produce? And the answer is yes, but only at the stage where the produce has not been fully processed. But if it's fully processed, to the point where at that point, the owner of the produce would be obligated to give meiser, okay, in a time when meiser is extant, right? In other words, he's saying that in Chutz La'aretz, there's no halacha of meiser, right? But if you were living in Eretz Yisrael and you would now become obligated to give meiser, then the employee or the animal at that point of processing is no longer allowed to eat from the produce. That's that mistest, and we'll I guess the Imrei Yaakov will explain this all to us. But there's a term that the Gemara uses called miruach hakri. Miruach hakri means that when let's say when you're harvesting wheat, miruach hakri is that after you've already threshed and winnowed and you've completely separated the kernel from the chaff, and now you have a pile of finished wheat kernels, and it's now in a nicely organized pile. Now you have miruach hakri, which means the smoothing out of the pile. At that point, the produce is subject to meiser, trumas and meiser, and at that point, if an employee wanted to nibble on some wheat, he wouldn't be allowed to take from the finished pile. But in the process of winnowing and threshing and of that whole separation process, any worker who wants to nibble on some wheat has a right to do so. Now, that's when it comes to that level of produce. Aval peros tulushim shenigmar malachtim lamaiser, eino ochel mehem kishosa bahem eza malacha o nosaam. But any finished produce, which would now be subject to meiser, you're not allowed to eat that produce, even if you're doing some kind of work with that produce, such as transporting the produce or packing it into crates or whatever. Shenemar bidisho, because the language of the pasuk is lo sachsom shor bidisho. You may not muzzle an animal in its dayish, which is the harvest. Ma dayish miyuchad shelo nigmar malachta lemaiser ad sheyispar heitev min hamotz. Af kol talush shelo nigmar malachta lemaiser. He says because dayish implies that it's not a finished product yet. It's during the harvesting process, and it hasn't been separated from the chaff. So too, only produce that has not yet been fully processed do we say that you're not allowed to muzzle the animal or the worker. Now, Bameh Dvarim Amurim, the Peiros, Shechiyuv Ha'acharon Shebahem Hu HaMaiser. He says, but that's only true with other produce where their final sort of act that you have to do to them is tithing. Aval chitin shehem omdim lasos mehem pas, v'yihi yabahen chiyuv chala, ochel keshaosa bahen ad shenischayvu b'chala, shehishas eruv hakemach b'mayim. He says, but wheat is different, and apparently all grain is different. In other words, when it comes to grain, there's an additional tithing that has to be done to grain after miruach hakri. What tithing is he referring to? What other tithing do we do? No, leket is not a form of tithing per se, and that's earlier. It's before anyway. No. In other words, after once you have miruach hakri, you have the pile of grain. it now becomes subject to all tithes, truma, meiser, meiser rishon, meiser sheni. But what additional gift do you have to give after a further processing of wheat? Challah. Exactly. And when do you tithe challah? When you've made it into dough, when you've mixed the wheat with water. That's when you become chayiv in challah. So in a case of wheat and other grain that is meant to be made into bread, or any other kind of flour confection, so you only become you're only limited from nibbling on the grain once the flour has been mixed with water. But before then, a worker or an animal would be allowed to nibble on the flour, I guess, in theory, okay, in order to satisfy themselves. So if you're working in, let's say, a bakery, you'd be allowed to take some of the unfinished product before the flour mixes with the water. Why you would want to take flour and eat it, I don't know. But in other words, this is what he's essentially saying, is that since it's still considered to be an unfinished product, you're allowed to continue, the law of prohibition of muzzling applies. And but if you work in a bakery, and once it's been made into dough, and during the baking process, you're not allowed to nibble on finished cookies in the bakery.
If you feel like you don't make enough dough, you can't make more. Yes,
Paul. Very good. Very good. Okay. V'chein hanose pas, v'chein habehema dina kapol b'cholzeh. Or similarly, if you're transporting bread, let's say you're a delivery service for a bakery. I can just imagine working in a delivery truck for freshly baked bread. The smell in the morning must be overwhelming, right? But the halacha is, no matter how pungent the fragrance of that freshly baked bread is, it's a finished product, and therefore you're not allowed to sample the goods for yourself, okay? Because it only applies in the processing of the pre-finished product, okay? And finally, animals have the same halacha as a human worker in all of these halachas. Okay, so let's take a look. So basically what we learned from here is that the only time that a worker or an animal is allowed to be eating from produce that it's working with is only before the product is finished as a ready-to-eat item. So if, for example, I'm harvesting tangerines or grapes or any other kind, or vegetables, so I'm only permitted to nibble on them so long that they have not been fully harvested and piled up in the warehouse, right? But if they're still in the process of processing, so for example, they've still got leaves on them, and we've got to pull off the branches and all of these other things that we do with produce before they're ready to be packed and shipped off to the market, I'm still allowed to nibble on that produce, okay? With grain, we're even more permissive, and we say that until the flour mixes with the water, it's still considered to be unprocessed, and therefore I'm still allowed to consume or nibble on parts of that produce until it becomes chayiv in challah. Okay, so let's take a look now at the Imrei Yaakov. So the example, the more appropriate example from an old world fruit would be, let's say in this sip, we're talking about harvesting grapes, okay? V'chein ba'anavim, the same thing would be true, let's say, with grapes. Im daito lechol mehem kamo shehein, harei nigmaru malachtan l'maiser, v'asur l'pol lechol mehem. He says, but it depends. Are these table grapes or are they wine grapes? Okay, if they're wine grapes, then what's their final processing? Not making it into wine. Or olives to make oil, you are allowed to eat from the fresh olives and the fresh grapes before they're pressed into oil or pressed into wine, because the Gemar Chiyuv and Lemaiser ena el alacher shenasa yain ba'ashemen ba'ain lekamen seif chavzayin. Because in that case, you don't become liable for Meiser until they're finally processed. They're finished. The processing is finished by making them into wine or oil. And we'll continue Mirz Hashem this halacha tomorrow. Okay?